Welcome to the Wild Side. I am your host, Kight, and that was Blitz and Trapper singing the song Echo / Always On / Easy Con. And I chose that song because the first thing I want to talk about today is echolocation, and this is going to be one of just many current events in science that I want to discuss with you guys this week. So the big story here is that there have been some genetic similarities uncovered between bats and dolphins. And this happened when scientists were exploring the genomic basis for echolocation. Now, if you listened to the show in the past, then you know already that echolocation is a complex trait that involves the production and the reception and the auditory processing of ultrasonic pulses that are used then in navigation and hunting behaviors in particular. And among mammals, we know that echolocation is found in some very distinct groups. So there are cetaceans, so animals including dolphins that live in the water, and then there are also bats that live on land, or if you like, in the air, that are using these very same things, even though they have very different habitats, very different sorts of behaviors. And this is an example of convergent evolution, where these very distinct animals in different places have come to the same evolutionary solution for some sort of problem in their environment, some sort of thing that they need to achieve. And it's a really interesting thing to look at because you can try to figure out whether these sorts of convergent evolution result from some genetic similarities or whether they've got completely different genes that are all allowing these animals to somehow come to that same ultimate behavior in the end. So it's kind of looking at what is the level at which these sorts of evolutionary events are taking place and what's the level at which we see convergence. Now, these scientists who were involved in this study compared the genomic sequences of 22 different mammals, and they found signs of convergence in over 200 different genomic regions among these animals. And this was particularly true when they were looking at the hearing genes. So these genes that are responsible for allowing the animals to receive those signals and process them once they've been produced in the water or in the air. And they were able to do this study by using a supercomputer because obviously this is a ton of data that they'd have to analyze. And so they had the computer look at each of the little portions of each animal's genome and look at where there are similarities and where there are differences. And the computer was taught how to calculate the probability that each similar gene was similar purely by chance, and which was similar probably because there was a sign of convergence, and these animals had the same sort of evolutionary drive towards this echolocation ability. And this computer basically was allowing them to develop kind of a way of looking for odd man out genes and genes that actually kind of fit within this broad picture of the evolution of echolocation. And what's really amazing is that they'd only expected to find about a dozen or so similarities. They had no idea that so many genes would be involved in creating this one single behavior. And that gives you an idea of just how amazing convergence is, because you've got, you could say it's kind of a simple behavior in a sense because it's just the production of a sound and the receiving of a sound and then reacting to it in some way. And that kind of three-part process could involve so many different genes, and that multiple different animals could have those genetic changes occur to help them do this behavior is a really amazing thing, and shows you just how strong that evolutionary selection must have been for this to happen multiple different times in different places and different species. And what the scientists hope is that this study will help us improve our understanding of genome evolution and also help us understand how multiple traits could emerge and change over time, leading to really complex systems like echolocation. If we've got convergence in other traits that are even more complex, and you could be looking at multiple hundreds, even thousands of genes that are working together to do this, and that would be a really phenomenal thing to look at. And also, you cannot just use this to kind of understand how this evolution happened over time, but also to predict cases where it might have happened that we don't know about already. So if you could then take some genomes of things and look for similarities and maybe find some that you didn't know about before, then you can look at the way that those similarities happen and kind of the patterns of those genomes to predict maybe whether or not those are convergent. And this is kind of interesting for just better understanding how the environment is influencing each of these species and how these species then are kind of pressed by those constraints and by that selective pressure to adapt and change over time. So the next study also kind of has a bit of an evolutionary implication, and this is a study that's in one particular habitat, not just a bunch of species from around the world, and it is a study of gelada monkeys. And researchers have recently suggested that these guys may provide a lot of insights into human speech. Now, gelada monkeys are also known as bleeding heart baboons because they have kind of an interesting pattern on their chests where it's really bright red kind of skin, and their fur doesn't cover it all, and it looks very much like a bleeding heart, hence the name. And these guys live in the highlands of Ethiopia. And quite rarely for primates, they're found in groups of up to 1,000 or so monkeys. And these groups are sometimes so large that individuals can frequently encounter animals that they've never met before. They've never encountered these animals, they've never interacted with them, and so it's quite a novel thing because most primates live in this size, a group size, where they are very aware of each different individual. And not only have they seen that individual before, not only do they likely know something about that animal, but they remember things and kind of decide how they're going to react towards these animals because of those previous experiences. So it's quite an unusual thing for group-living mammals to be in large groups where they would frequently encounter someone they don't know. And this is something that can really alter their behaviors. Now, of course, we're a primate that does this all the time, and we do behave very differently in many respects from some of our other social living relatives. So what's interesting is that because of these very large groups and this kind of strange sort of encounter, the societies of these monkeys are characterized by really fluid relationships. Those animals meet new animals, they might decide they're going to hang out with someone different, they might form coalitions where they have kind of a core group of friends and then some other friends that they know less well and they're less likely to hang out with. It can get really complicated. And then you kind of further complicate things by throwing in the sex system. And these animals are polygamous, so they've got a single male that has lots of females that he's going to kind of hang out with and mate with. And then there are going to be bachelor males kind of on the periphery of that who are looking to take over those little harems, if you like, and to get in with the ladies. But the females aren't going to just be passed around like possessions. They are actively choosing which males they're going to associate with. And so because of this, you frequently have fights arising as individuals are challenging each other for mates and also space and other resources that are around in the environment. So it can be kind of a tense situation. And this is particularly true because these animals have really long canines, and they can be quite violent. They in fact have the longest canine to body length ratio among mammals, so these can be really vicious. But what's really interesting is that their vocalizations are also very important. So whenever they have conflicts, whenever they're meeting new animals and greeting new animals, they can produce really complex strings of vocalizations, and these potentially can help them mitigate any discomfort and avoid conflict. And these vocalizations could have lots of functions and lots of meanings, and that's exactly what the researchers here are looking into. Now, the most complex vocalizations are those that are delivered by males after conflicts, and these appear to be used to kind of return things to normal, so that individuals know that the fight is no longer happening, someone's forgiven, there's no longer an issue, they're just going to move on and get back to life. And these noises are kind of like a gurgling sound, and they're associated not just with the acoustic production of noise, but also a lot of facial coordination. And that's what is the really interesting thing, is that they have an amazing amount of facial movement, the movement of lips, the movement of the face itself, and contorting all of these things simultaneously in order to produce sound. And that's very similar to what is observed in humans. Now, in many other primates, when you do have those kind of fight situations breaking out, rather than vocalizing to return things back to normal, the animals will kind of groom each other in order to pacify the animals that are upset. So this system suggests that some primates, at least, will use vocalizations in a calming way and use sounds not just to express very specific information, I'm angry at you, the food is over there, there's an eagle coming to prey on us, but just to kind of provide a sense, a general emotion that it would kind of cause to rise up in its listeners. So for example, what the researchers are likening this to is if you have a conversation with someone and you don't really remember what you say, you might still remember kind of whether it was a good conversation or not. You know, did you guys laugh a lot? Did you have a fight? Did you leave it feeling good about yourself, or were you quite sad? So it's not necessarily important to remember exactly what information was relayed, but just so much the sense of what was happening in that conversation. And that's potentially what's happening with these gelada monkeys, that they're not really saying anything referential to point out an object or teach or something like that, but they're just trying to kind of pass on an emotion. And the question this raises is whether humans or even human predecessors might have started off making vocalizations like these. So maybe we weren't trying to describe things, maybe we weren't trying to coordinate something really specific and pass on very detailed knowledge, but maybe we're just trying to kind of pacify, the way that maybe we murmur to a young child that's upset, or kind of coo, or maybe sing a nice song. So these kinds of gentle sounds that might have another function entirely. And one interesting thing about this is that when you make those sounds, you're kind of getting your mouth, your face, all your muscles used to making these sorts of movements and these sorts of noises. So the researchers liken this to limbering up our lips and our throats and our tongues with these noises that could be used for comfort, for warning, to provide encouragement, that sort of thing. So all these kind of nonverbal sorts of communication. So this is one of the first times that anyone has suggested that the first noises that humans spoke may not have been descriptive so much as aimed at just making connections and kind of reassuring others around us. And this all is being researched as we speak. Actually, the news coverage of this was coverage describing how these researchers have been awarded a grant by the National Geographic Society, I think, and they're going out to study these guys in the wild, and they're hoping to add more knowledge than we already have and kind of figure out whether these theories are correct or not. So you'll have to wait and let me get back to you and tell you when there is an update, which hopefully there will be. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Chris Isaac with Talk to Me. And before the break, I was talking a little bit about talking, as it were, with monkeys, and before that I was talking a little bit about echolocation, and now I want to completely change gears and talk a little bit about hibernation. And this next study that I want to discuss is a study that found that hibernation occurs in a primate species, and this was not known to happen previously. Researchers did never think that primates were able to hibernate. But they have now discovered one that can, and it is named the fat-tailed dwarf lemur, and this is a species that lives in Madagascar. And what's kind of interesting is that we tend to think of hibernation as something that happens in really cold climates and in cold conditions, but of course Madagascar it isn't very well known for having really bad winters. It's a place where a kind of cool temperatures might be somewhere in the, I don't know, maybe the teens at most, but that's kind of one of the interesting things about this study, is that hibernation isn't just this thing that happens when animals go to sleep over the winter. What it really refers to is the fact that you've just got some kind of seasonal changes that are related to differences in the environment. So animals will change their heart rates, their oxygen intake, their body temperature regulation, and that sort of thing in response to a seasonal change. And it doesn't have to be a really extreme seasonal change, and it doesn't have to be just associated with what we would refer to as winter, with really cold temperatures and lots of snow. But it's just a change that's perceived by these animals relative to what their normal kind of habitat would be like. And what's really amazing about these lemurs is that it's not just that they can engage in hibernation behavior, but also that they can last the entire hibernation period, which can be up to 8 months, without fully sleeping. And this is something I'll get into here in a bit more detail, because it really is the nuances of this hibernation behavior and what hibernation is in general that make this discovery particularly interesting. So when the lemurs hibernate, what they tend to do is show several really strong changes in response to this different behavior. So the first thing is that they slow their inhalation rate, so they can go down as low as only 1 inhalation per 20 minutes, which is pretty remarkable. Their heart rate also drops from about 200 beats per minute down to 4 beats per minute, which is a massive change. And they appear to stay in an REM sleep stage. And this is a stage where the animals have increased brain activity, rapid eye movements, and also muscle paralysis. And you'll maybe remember these things from a previous episode in which I talked about sleep and how sleep works. So these are all kind of those initial stages of sleep that we go through before we go into a really deep, kind of refreshing sleep. And what's amazing is that the lemurs seem to be stuck in this REM sleep stage. They never go down into that deep non-REM sleep. And this is quite a weird thing, because if they're not spending this 8-month period getting some sort of replenishment, what do they get out of it? What is the purpose of hibernating? What is the purpose of kind of half sleeping, if you like? Well, in the past, researchers have found that research animals, so things like rats, that are deprived of non-REM sleep will quickly start to show a lot of health malfunctions, basically. They'll lose weight, they'll develop kind of scabs, they'll get really sickly and kind of act depressed, they aren't able to think very clearly, and eventually they will die. So within a month or so they will die if they're not able to have this sort of sleep. And humans have never been found to go very long without non-REM sleep. The longest documented is about 18 days, but even that is hard to say, because that's kind of a self-reported thing. And people might say that they're not falling asleep, but actually they might have moments where they kind of nod off and they just don't realize it. But basically the idea is that we really need to have that replenishing sleep for some reason or another that's not really yet fully understood. So it's kind of a weird thing to think that there are animals that could potentially go all this time without getting into that sleep, when normally that kind of state would kill you. And what's really cool is that this study was performed in the wild. Lemurs in captivity often don't hibernate at all, so researchers had to go out in the wild to study this. And they had to put out nest boxes that they could place the hibernating lemurs into, and they could run electrodes into, so they could monitor the animal's brain activity. So they really did, they weren't just watching the lemurs and making a guess as to what they were doing. They actually did measure this stuff in a very scientific and objective way. And they found that these EEGs that they were taking suggested that the REM-only hibernation appeared to be related to warm temperatures. So it was evidently enough of a seasonal change to go into hibernation, but it wasn't incredibly, cool. It was still pretty warm. It wasn't putting them all the way over into that kind of, polar bear type hibernation that we might imagine when we think about what animals hibernate. So maybe it's related to the temperature. Maybe if it had gotten cooler, they would have gone into that other type of sleep. Maybe it has to do with the warmth of Madagascar. But either way, it's really interesting, because lemurs are genetically similar to humans, actually quite similar to humans, and they are one of our close relatives, that we all descended from the same predecessor, so there could be some kind of basal mechanism that we all have in common that relates to sleep, even though we're now kind of different. So this could be something that eventually we are capable of achieving as well. And this is something that could actually be very useful. It's not just a kind of a thought exercise. So if you think about the fact that sometimes you have ill patients that don't have organs prepared for them, they aren't ready to get to receive an organ for whatever reason, if we could put them into a hibernation of sorts and wait until an organ is ready or until their body is capable of receiving it, then we could maybe save the lives of people that otherwise wouldn't be savable. Similarly, if you've got soldiers that are wounded out in the field, or people that are in an emergency situation of some sort, maybe they've gotten into a car crash, if you can put them into a type of hibernation and wait until you can get them back to a facility where you can take better care of them, again, that could save a lot of lives. This is also something that has kind of sci-fi implications. So if you've got people who need to go, need or want to go to space and travel long distances, then you could put them into some sort of a hibernation and allow them to sleep while they travel from one place to another. And in general, hibernators do tend to live longer than non-hibernators. So being able to hibernate might allow us to increase our lifespans if that's something that people want to do. Though of course one of the ways that you can do this is simply by sleeping through part of your life, so I'm not really sure how much you'd get out of it. But being able to sleep through certain portions might be really useful for one reason or another. And what I think is really neat about this study is that it does highlight the fact that we really still know so little about sleep. And in fact, the question of why we sleep is still considered to be one of the great remaining mysteries of science. And the more that we find out about how other animals sleep or don't sleep, as the case may be, it might allow us to finally reach some sort of a conclusion about what is the purpose of sleep and how can this actually help us in some way or another. Now again, to change gears quite dramatically, these science findings this week were all over the place, so this is going to be quite a variety show today. The next study that I have dug up is one that's about dogs and robots. And researchers have found that dogs' interactions with robots can be used by researchers and designers to assess whether computers are really acting in a socially appropriate manner. And the idea here is that if you build a computer and then have a dog interact with it in a social way, then you can see how that dog is relating to the computer in order to see whether the computer is being perceived as kind of human-like. And if that's what you're going for, then the more the dog interacts with it in that human way, then the better you have done. And the less the dog interacts, then obviously you have some changes that you need to make. And this is a kind of a funny study because basically what these people did was they looked at how dogs were behaving towards these robots after they watched the robots have a relationship, some sort of a back and forth with a human. So the dogs were basically they were evaluating the social interaction that happened in order to then decide how their own behavior should be. And the researchers found that the dogs would interact more socially if the robots initiated interactions in a sociable way. This is interesting, of course, not just for computer design, but also just thinking about how it is that animals assess whether something is social, whether something's an animal, whether they want to interact with it, etc. It's obviously a very complex thing. So how do they do all of this? Well, they had an asocial group and a social group. And in the asocial group, the dogs they were able to watch an interaction between a dog owner and an experimenter, so two different humans, and also between the dog's owner and a robot. And then the dogs were placed in a situation with the robot after having seen those two things that they could compare. In the social group, the dogs were able to watch the interaction between a dog owner and an experimenter, and then also a social reaction between an owner and a robot. And in the first, when the owner and the robot interacted, it was an asocial sort of thing, and it wasn't really treating that robot like it was a person. So maybe it was just sitting at the computer kind of tapping at it a little bit, or just standing by the robot and not really engaging with it as though it were a person. But in the social interaction, you've actually got the person treating the robot as though it's a human, and the robot responding in some way or another. So it really is kind of about the cues that the human is using to show the dog that the robot is being perceived as a human, and also the cues that the robot then is delivering whenever it's interacting back with that dog owner. So after the dog saw these two different types of interactions, either the human experimenter or the robot would then be around to point out food stores to the dogs. And the idea is that the dog should theoretically respond more socially towards that human experimenter because it is it's a more social being that's already known to be a social being, and you're going to respond better to a human if you're more familiar with humans. But if the robot is really well designed and it has been able to interact with the humans in a very social way, then perhaps the dog will also react to the robots as strongly as they do to the human experimenters. And I guess I should take a moment here to describe the robot itself. So it's something called a people bot, and this has two arms which each have hands on them, and one arm can make gestures and also grasp objects. And basically it looks kind of like a podium, maybe like someone took the front piece off of a treadmill, so those two little things that stand up and then have the computer bit stretching across the front. So it kind of looks like that, with a computer sat on top of it and then these two arms attached. So it doesn't really look very human. It's not like something from iRobot or Data from Star Trek. It very much does look like a thing. But because it can move those arms and kind of gesture around, then it can kind of appear like it's interacting with a human in a social way. And you can also have it speak and make noises, so it's able to call a dog by its name, or you can program it to be very much just like a computer and not have those sorts of interactions at all. So there is kind of a range of behaviors that these computers can do. And what the researchers found is that the kind of social style robots were not really equivalent to the human experimenters. However, they were better than the more asocial robots. So it looks like we're kind of on the right track to creating these sorts of human-like robots, but we haven't quite gotten there just yet. So when Peoplebot was more social, dogs did seem to spend more time near it. They spent more time gazing at kind of its head region. They were also a little bit better at finding food when the socialized robot pointed out to them. And these were all things that were quite noticeable. So there was some difference between that social robot and the asocial robot. But it was always more difficult for dogs to relate to the robot than to the human experimenters. So there, as I said, there is still that gap. And the researchers suggest that these positive interactions, this progress that does seem to have been made, probably resulted from the fact that the dogs were watching their owners' reactions and then using those reactions to decide, as I said, how they should act. And if you've listened to the show before, then it shouldn't come as any surprise to you that there is this very close relationship between dogs and humans. We have evolved together over thousands of years, and both of us, in terms of species, seem to be able to read each other's facial expressions and body language, so we do have quite a lot of knowledge. So one of the really interesting things about this study is not just the robot thing, so much as how well the dogs are able to perceive how we're perceiving the things that we're interacting with. So if you've ever had a dog that didn't like someone that you didn't like, or was acting a bit funny towards maybe a burglar or someone that turned out to be bad, now you know why. So these guys really are quite clever, and they can discern these things, and they can pick up on your little cues and act on that themselves. So what does all of this mean in terms of robot stuff? Well, the scientists involved in this suggest that in the future, maybe what we should do is use a lot of these sorts of encounters in order to assess the sociality of the robots that we are designing. Particularly, of course, you don't need every robot to behave in a very human way, but if we do have interactive robots, so like those little white ones that you might have seen, I've seen them on QI and I forget what they're called, but they're now capable of walking and running, and they can bring you stuff. And this is a Japanese firm that makes these, and they're becoming really popular, and people are quite excited because they are quite human-like in many ways. So, these sorts of things that we want to act as our friends, maybe act as our butlers, that sort of thing, you would like them to be a bit more human. And potentially bringing in animals as well as humans to test out these interactions could really help us make these things a lot more three-dimensional and interesting and very personable. Welcome back to The Wild Side. I'm your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Marina and the Diamonds with I Am Not a Robot. And I picked that song because just before the break we were talking about how dogs can help us design better robots, potentially. And now I am also going to stay on that kind of techno theme because I want to talk about how maybe recording devices and acoustic equipment can be used to help us scare Asian elephants away from agricultural fields and therefore reduce human-animal conflict and maybe save a lot of elephant and human lives. And the way in which this technology can potentially be used is to play back recordings of tiger growls and use these growls to make elephants think that there are tigers in the area, so they won't be inclined to go any further and to potentially run into these animals. And this is amazing, maybe to some of you, that an animal as large as as large as an elephant could be frightened of a tiger. But tigers are, quite large. They do have lots of claws and teeth that are very sharp. And even if they don't necessarily spend a whole lot of time hunting down elephants, especially adult elephants, they can still do a lot of damage. And there seems to be some kind of innate fear and wariness in elephants. They have learned some lessons about these guys in the past, and so they'd rather be safe than sorry and avoid them. And this is not entirely surprising to see this sort of thing in an Asian elephant, because there have been lots of studies in the past on African elephants that have shown that there are other animals that make them quite hesitant, and they are able to discriminate the sounds of these guys and the sights and smells of these guys out of the environment, and then use those cues to stay away. So for example, lions are able to hear elephant growls, obviously, we all can, but they're able to distinguish between females and males, and they will act more frightened of male growls than of female growls, because males are the ones that are more likely to hunt elephants. So they do respond in a very appropriate manner to the sounds of male lion growling. They also are frightened, apparently, of African honeybees, and they can hear the buzzing of these bees, and then they'll avoid areas in which that sound is being made. They also can distinguish between friendly and dangerous humans by their scent. So there are lots of things that these guys pick up on in the environment, and they use those cues to stay out of areas where they could potentially be in trouble. So all of this stuff that I just mentioned has been looked at in African elephants, and no one had previously investigated it in Asian elephants, and that's where the current study came from. And researchers had heard that there was an Indian farmer in the southern part of the country who was playing tiger growls to scare elephants off his property. And they thought that sounded quite intriguing, very cool, and they thought, well, you know, maybe there is actually a scientific basis for this, and if there is, then we could do a little study and then suggest, if it works well enough, that people roll this out on a much larger scale and use this around the country to help them reduce encounters with elephants. So what they did is they camouflaged video cameras and placed them along roads in the countryside at nighttime. And of course, night is the time when you've got cats that are out prowling, and it's also the time when elephants are likely to go out and raid crops. And near the video cameras, they also placed speakers, and they played back two different types of recordings. One was recordings of tiger growls, and another was recordings of leopard growls. Now, I don't know if you know your cats very well, but leopards are not as big as tigers, and they are much less likely to engage with elephants in general, and especially they're not as likely to engage with adult elephants. Now, tigers will take down young elephants, and I suppose leopards probably do every now and then as well, but it really is the tiger that should have been scary in this circumstance, and not nearly so much the leopard, which would look for generally smaller prey. So they played both of these types of growls in different types of places, and what they found was that elephants, as soon as they heard the tiger growls, they would kind of pause and then quietly slink off. They obviously wanted to have nothing to do with being in that area where those tigers supposedly were. However, when they heard the leopard growls, they basically reacted as though they'd seen the predator and wanted to scare it off. So they would stomp and they'd circle, they'd trumpet, and then eventually they'd retreat. So even though it seems that leopards probably aren't going to be that dangerous to them, they, again, would rather be safe than sorry, and so they do their little display and then get out of there. So what's fascinating is that they are able, judging from their behaviors, to tell these different animals apart. And this could be related to a few things. Basically, if you've heard the show before, you know I've talked a lot about vocalizations and acoustic signals, so I won't go into lots of details in case I've got some repeat listeners here. But you've got all sorts of differences in frequencies and in amplitudes and in temporal characteristics, so just little subtle variations in how long certain sounds will last or how long in between sounds. So there are lots of things that you could use to distinguish between species or even between individuals of a species. And the researchers say that they think maybe it has to do with the pulse patterns of the vocalizations. So how many different little bits there are making up a single vocalization, and how long each of those bits is, and how much space there is in between all those little bits. And the thing is, the elephants also do produce growling sounds, so they tend to have very sensitive hearing, and they're able to discriminate between other elephants, so from one individual to another, using very small acoustic differences. So they do have the type of hearing that would be quite attuned to those sorts of changes and would enable them to distinguish between all these different sorts of cats, or in this case, just two different types of cats. So what they're really hoping now is that we can deploy this in a conservation setting. Now they first want to try to scale this up a little bit, because this was just a relatively small study. And what they'd like to do is to have actual loudspeakers near agricultural fields in lots of different places and see how successful they are. Now they are a little bit worried that the elephants could become complacent over time And they'll hear these sounds again and again and never have any sort of attack and think, well, actually, it's probably not that dangerous after all. It's kind of the scarecrow effect that we have, with animals getting used to the things we place out there to scare them off. So you have to move them around or change them up in some way to make them maintain their feeling of fear, I guess, and their power over the animals. So they're hoping that maybe they could move them around the fields or take them away and put them back and just kind of experiment with different ways of keeping the response fresh, basically. And this could potentially reduce the number of elephant attacks and also of people getting killed, because approximately 200 people die every year, generally because they go out after elephants have raided their crops and they chase the elephants down. The elephants get mad and stampede, and then the people get killed in the process. And so we've got elephants dying and also people dying, and maybe all of these guys could have their lives saved by technology like this. So it's a very cool potential development, although again it does need some further research just to see if this would actually work on a large scale. Alright, so the very last study that I want to talk about today is incredibly different from basically everything I've talked about, so we're ending on kind of a fun note. And this is something that you may have already heard about a little bit because it has gotten quite a lot of press, because it's quite an unusual and interesting finding. And basically what it is that scientists have discovered that there is a species of insect called a plant hopper that has meshing gears in its legs. And this is a really exciting thing because it's incredibly different, it's brand new, no one's ever seen this before in quite this way, and so it is quite a splash for people to have found basically something that humans thought that they created, but there it is out in nature in another organism. So plant hoppers, you may have seen them in the past, they're out in your garden most likely. They are little insects that are incredibly talented jumpers. They're very good at taking off quite quickly, so within 2 milliseconds. They also can cover a lot of space in very little time, so they can move at something like just about 4 meters per second, which is pretty phenomenal considering how tiny these things are. And the insects that were studied in this particular research project were actually ones that were found right in one of the researchers' back gardens. And he was looking at it and looking at how it behaved and was thinking, this is really incredible, not just the adult behavior, but in particular the behavior of the little nymph stages. And what they found was that the little larvae, they have interlocking gears in their hind legs that help them move in this way. And this species that was studied here is called Issus coleoptratus. Hopefully I'm not pronouncing that too poorly. And it actually had been seen previously by a German biologist in 1957. But he reported this result in a study that wasn't really very detailed, and it kind of fell out of history, basically. It's not online anywhere, it's kind of an obscure thing, and so no one's really looked into it in much detail. And after these researchers spotted these things in their back garden and got kind of curious about them, they were able to take them into the laboratory and use modern technology to find out much more than we ever knew in the past. So they were able to film the little guys at a rate of about 5,000 frames per second, which is really incredible because when you slow that down you can see quite a lot of detail in slow motion, so you can really see every little thing that happens within a jump. And what they discovered is that at the top of each of the hind legs there's a little bulb where the leg kind of, it's just kind of more bulbous rather than thin and spindly, which is generally, I think, how we think of insect legs. And the bulb, each bulb has about 10 to 12 teeth. And these are tiny little teeth. They're about 15 to 30 micrometers long. And that's so small that I can't even really envision how big it is. And so it's basically like the hind leg is topped by a biological cog. And these things interlock, which allows the legs to then move in unison. And one leg will move within 30 microseconds of the other leg during a jump. And this allows them to have really good synchrony. And the synchrony that is achieved by these structures might be even better than the synchrony you can get just by having a neuronal connection saying, right, now you've moved this leg, let's move this leg as well. So it may be even faster than having those really quick electrical signals sent through the brain into the rest of the body. And that is how the researchers think these might have evolved. So how unique are these structures? Well, other animals do actually have gears, but none of them are known to intermesh in the way that these guys do in the plant hoppers. And it might be that they don't exist, or it might be that they just haven't been discovered. But we do know that we've seen lots of insects in lots of detail and have never found this, and we've never seen it in other species as well. So for now, it certainly is quite rare and quite exciting. Now, the original German study suggested that all 2,000 some plant hopper species might have similar gears, but we don't know that for sure. You'd have to do quite an extensive research project to look for this in all those other species too. And basically right now we just know that the gears are found only in the larval plant hoppers but not in the adults, and we're not sure why that is, and that's something to follow up on as well. And the scientists who did this study suggest that perhaps the gears break easily, and since these guys only go through a single molt, maybe it's better to just have a more robust way of moving your legs together. And in this case, these guys rely on friction between the part of the body called the trochanter, and that's kind of the upper leg, hip area. And basically, because there's movement of one, it rubs against the other and makes it move as well. And this might be much more reliable than having a gear where the teeth could break off. But again, that is something that can be studied in the future. So that is all I have for this week's Science News Roundup, and I'm going to end on Keb Mo singing Shave Your Legs, and I will talk to you next week. Thanks a lot for listening.